I'm going to be talking about essentially part of this book that I spent much of the pandemic writing. Uh, People had different responses to the pandemic, personally and professionally, and my main professional responses were to uh, get a podcast going and to write a book. And I'll mention the podcast later, but because I couldn't do field work, and many of us had field work disrupted during the pandemic, I decided it was time to try my hand at the first book project, which you see the result of here, called Common Boundaries: The Theory and Practice of Environmental Property. The overall book is a synthesis across multiple disciplines of what we think we know about the kind of the is and the should of environmental ownership, from economics to evolutionary theory to environmental anthropology. And it very much, in my mind, grows out of the tradition at the Ostrom workshop to do really good case-based empirical work, but there's been a long-standing interest in conducting syntheses, most notably through meta-analyses and projects like the IFRI project. So for me, this was the culmination of really a process that began, I moved to Indiana in 2004. So it was a chance to kind of take a step back and kind of honestly do more reading than I had done since I graduated, stopped being a graduate student, because once you start teaching and do these other things, it turns out you don't have as much time to actually read and learn new things anymore. So that was really a welcome privilege. And before I dive in a bit more, I just want to reflect a little bit on why we think, why Lynn and other folks. I will say it's just very nice to be talking to folks at the Ostrom workshop, because I feel like we're already kind of speaking more of the same language that I'm used to in many other contexts. But right, like why are syntheses important, right? And I think it relates to the framing of science as a public good, and this idea that we're all kind of trying to contribute to this house of knowledge by adding individual bricks. There's this really wonderful paper that says that we need to not just think about the individual bricks, but the overall house. And there's been a lot of good work showing that the commons field, like many other fields, struggles with a bottleneck of synthesis, because we have all these bricks that are being produced, but they're not being necessarily produced in ways that keep in mind all the other aspects of knowledge that we're trying to produce. So that was kind of the theoretical motivation here, is take a step back and really try to synthesize what's known across a multitude of disciplines, including economics and political science, but some of the less appreciated disciplines that also have something to say about environmental ownership. So that all said, here's a short outline of the book. I have learned that it is not a good idea to try to talk to you about all of this, particularly in a rather shorter talk. But here's the overall outline of the book that is going to be published by Agenda Publishing in early 2024. I'm going to talk to you about this first section, which is entitled Collective Action and Property Rights, and really provides a theory for the rest of the book by talking to you, basically talking about what I'm going to talk to you about today, which is the relationship between collective action theory and environmental ownership. Because I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about that, I'll just briefly mention what the rest of the book does so you have a sense of it. Section 2 really unpacks this idea of the bundle of rights. The most famous article that's building on there is one that I imagine many to most of you are aware of, which is Adela Schlager and Lynn Ostrom's article in 1992, talking about the different bundles of rights. That was published in 1992. There's been a lot of really fantastic work building on that to try to really synthesize what does it mean to really say that you own something. And so that whole section really kind of updates what was known in 1992 with the literature that's been published since. Section 3 talks a lot about property regimes and also develops the theory of panaceas. We talk a lot about panaceas, but I took the opportunity there to really develop a more synthetic theory of what is a panacea, what are the conditioning factors, how do we know when we really see one, what are the ingredients to thinking about a policy as if it really is a cure-all. And I'm not going to go into this more, so if there are questions about these in the Q&A, I can go into them more. The panacea section is linked to the property regime section because most of the panaceas that we deal with have to do one way or another with a certain type of property regime, whether it's individual or state ownership, or now more popularly co-management and other more supposedly flexible regimes, have all kind of retrieved what I would call the panacea treatment at different times. So with that said, I'm going to talk really about section 1 and really the first 3 chapters here. So I'm going to start, basically I have a slide for each of these first 3 chapters. I'm going to walk you through the arguments that I'm making to set up the rest of the book. So we're going to start off really with the tragedy of the commons, which I'm sure people are aware of here. Introduced by Garrett Hardin, 1968. We envision a pasture that's open to all. This has, I think, been correctly nuanced later on to really be about, I'm having to move my Zoom windows around to see what I'm showing you here. I think this, since 1968, it's better appreciated that what's really being talked about here is the tragedy of the open access commons. So it's less about the condition of the resource itself and more about the institutions or the lack of institutions that are put in place to restrict the shared use of, say, a pasture, leading to the deterioration of a shared resource. But fair enough, right? So we're building on that. And it's important to start here in a book about environmental property because this is, put this way, very much a story about the lack of property, right? Open access is often talked about a property regime, but really it's referring to the lack of any kind of property regime. So one of the main motivations for any kind of environmental ownership is this idea of the tragedy of the commons, that if people own the land, better things will happen than if they don't. So one of the things I really want to highlight, which is the basis for a lot of my analysis in the first chapter, is why is this called a tragedy and how it relates to the theory of collective action. One of the points that I really hammer home with my students when I'm teaching them about collective action, and specifically a collective action problem, relates to this idea of the group interest, right? So a collective action problem is a divergence between individual interest and the group interest. So you have this idea of a collective, and there's something that's good for all of them that's different from what's good for their individuals. One of the main ways my students slip up with this is to not really identify what is in the interest of the group. And if you don't have a group interest, you can't really say that you have a collective action problem, at least in my view. And this also helps us understand why this is called the tragedy of the commons, right? It's because there is a group interest and we're failing to reach it. So we could have achieved a win-win, but instead it's a lose-lose. It's not a trade-off here. Everyone's losing, and thus it's a tragedy. I'd be remiss, of course, if I didn't mention Lynn in this context. One of my favorite papers of hers, if you haven't read this, you should go back and read it. I believe she wrote it when she was the president of the American Political Science Association. She starts it with a bold claim that says the theory of collective action is a central subject of political science. In some ways, I agree with this. In some ways, I don't. In the ways in which I do, I think Lynn was almost underselling the importance of collective action. I have colleagues who study collective action among bacteria who face collective action problems in producing the biofilms they all depend on as a public good. Collective action, it has been effectively argued, is really a boundary object across multiple scientific disciplines. Collective action problems are kind of arguably the social dilemma that kind of all life has to face. And if you look at studies of the evolution of different behaviors, understanding different behaviors as resolving or not collective action problems is often one of the most interesting and important questions you can ask. So I certainly think Lynn was correct in the sense that this is an incredibly important framing for political science, but also other sciences as well. And so now I want to nuance this, and this is largely what I do for the rest of this chapter. I think one of the struggles that I had, and I think many people have with collective action, and honestly with some of the Ostromian corpus, is how do we deal, and this is where this also relates to the issue of water specifically, how do we deal with asymmetries between different actors? And this has also been discussed a fair amount in the commons literature. If you have, say, an upstream actor and a downstream actor, for example, who are taking water from a river, there is an asymmetry in the sense that the upstream actor can impact the welfare of the downstream actor, but not vice versa. And so the lack of the possibility for reciprocity here, I think, can be argued to diminish the extent to which there is a common or group interest. And so the way I'm defining it here, this mitigates, and I don't think it's binary. It's not that you have a collective action problem or you don't, but this mitigates the extent to which you can say that there is a group interest to support a collective action framing here. One of my favorite books, and so one of the enjoyable things about writing a synthesis book is, again, that I've actually got to read a lot of other case studies and learn from them. One of my favorite ones that I read that I would recommend to everyone here is Perfect Order by Stephen Lansing, which I actually learned about during my time in Indiana, who talks about the Balinese Subaks and how they address this essentially upstream downstream conflict. And it's well understood in the commons literature on irrigation systems that they do in fact involve collective action problems, but the most significant one has to do, at least in community managed systems, with the management, construction and management of the irrigation infrastructure, which makes the water available to create an upstream downstream conflict in the first place. And Lynn and other folks actually documented that when this collective action problem is removed from some of these systems, if, for example, the state of Nepal decides that it's going to manage these, then the interdependence implicit in this collective action problem to build infrastructure is removed. You therefore simply have the upstream downstream conflict that remains, and negative consequences have sometimes resulted. So having a collective action problem can actually be beneficial in the sense that it represents a possible win-win outcome and the possible reciprocal relationship between actors that are involved. Stephen Lansing, I won't get into it too much, but has just his own incredible story to tell about how the Balinese Subak specifically resolved their upstream downstream conflict by dint of the shared management of a series of pests, a population of pests in Bali. The long story short is that the upstream farmers need to coordinate the fallowing of their fields with downstream farmers in order to create a bottleneck on pest populations. And if they don't, pest populations explode, which they do, or they did, when traditional practices were replaced by Green Revolution practices that remove the coordinated fallowing. So there's many ways in which an upstream downstream conflict can be can still involve the introduction of a collective action problem to ultimately motivate collective action in water systems and elsewhere. So one kind of generalization that I think is important to make here is that upstream downstream relationships can occur across space and time, right? So I've been talking about space. They can also occur across time. I once had one student of mine, I think, very cleverly pointed out, right, that one of the ways we think about intergenerational conflict is that future generations are downstream of current generations. And it's really the same logic that applies, right? They depend on us, but we don't depend on them. So that mitigates the extent to which we're kind of, quote unquote, all in this together. It's been shown in a lot of the collective action literature that heterogeneities of interest and resources can mitigate the extent to which there actually is a group or shared interest within a group, and that this can diminish the incentives for collective action. And also, and I think this is really interesting and important to talk about in the context of, again, the Ostrom workshop, where all of us are, a lot of us think about institutions as being the answers or the things that we might want to prescribe. And often, of course, institutions can be the problem themselves. So I've done a fair amount of work on water management in the Western US. If you've been to the Western US and you've studied water there, you know that the dominant management regime there is prior appropriation, which implements the very common logic of you got there first, you get it, which is the basis for essentially all kinds of rights claims around the world. But they also state that they use a hierarchical ordering of rights, where they say that if you have a more senior right than me, you get all of your water before I get any of mine, which really creates a kind of institutional upstream-downstream relationship. And we found in some of our work that creating kind of institutional upstream-downstream relationships in this hierarchical way also decreases the incentive for senior water rights holders to act collectively with downstream water rights holders. So these relationships can also be created by the rules of the game. So one of the final things I talk about in the first chapter, where I'm really kind of interrogating this idea of the tragedy of the commons, is talk a little bit about, how helpful or not is this framing of something as a collective action problem or not. And one of my favorite books that I read in this context is called Winners Take All by Anand Giridharadas, who argues that win-win framings can be problematic because they ignore the politics of the problems we're trying to solve. It's nice if we can identify a group interest because that means everyone can win, or at least there doesn't have to be hard trade-offs between winners and losers. So it's a very it's arguably he would argue, and I buy this to a degree, an artificially apolitical framing of our problems. Now, maybe that's kind of what you want to do. It's also been argued that a collective action framing as a potential win-win framing can be an important mechanism for coalition building. Again, this idea that we're all in this together, we can all win together, or we can all lose together. And there's been interesting arguments about whether or not global climate change is a collective action problem that involves both of these arguments. In some ways, yes, global climate change certainly is a collective action problem, but there certainly are individuals and countries that have disproportionately contributed to the problem, and by dint of that are disproportionately wealthy and buffered from the potential impacts of climate change. And so there's arguably an asymmetry there as well that mitigates the collective dependence and interest on a stable climate. So again, I think both answers are ultimately correct, but it's important to nuance this kind of collective action framing by an understanding of the asymmetries and politics at play when we're starting to think about the tragedy of commons as a motivation for environmental ownership, which is my context for the book. Chapter 2 is where I really developed one of the main theories of the book, which is the idea of the theory of environmental reciprocity. Reciprocity is, along with kinship, in the theory of evolution in the theory of the evolution of cooperation, really what you find are kinship and reciprocity being the main two mechanisms for the development and maintenance of cooperation. And this is basically the overtime tit for tat strategy. I help you, you help me, which is direct reciprocity. And in order to run direct reciprocity, one of the most important enabling factors is simply having a stable partner over time so that you can develop trust and you can have this tit for tat over time. And so again, across species, it's been shown that if you can develop institutions and rules in a context that lets people have a stable partner over time, that is one of the main enabling factors for having reciprocal relationships. So there is this idea that high costs of entry and exit can create a common interest, right? So if you have high costs of exit, it's hard to leave a relationship, and if you have high cost of entry, it means you can't have a free rider benefiting from a stable relationship, a stable reciprocal relationship. So I've replaced here one of the people icons with a tree because I think a lot of the arguments for the importance of environmental ownership ultimately reduce to this idea of a reciprocal relationship with the environment. Right. So I mentioned earlier, okay, like the tragedy of commons, if we don't have ownership over the environment, people will treat it more poorly. But what is the actual mechanism there? And I think a lot of the argumentation ultimately reduces to this idea that I will take care of something insofar as I have a stable long-term relationship with that, such that the way I treat it impacts how it quote unquote treats me or how I can derive benefit from it in the future. And in the book, I nuance this a bit more by talking about different ways we might treat the environment by, say, developing it or stewarding it. But I think the core logic is that if I have rights, those rights help enable a long-term relationship between me and the environment that incentivizes me to act in ways towards the environment that will help it benefit me in the future. So I think the logic of reciprocity remains. So this relates strongly to the idea of boundaries and particularly the right of exclusion, right? We want boundaries around the relationships we have with social partners and the relationships we have with the environment, aka we want property rights. So the right of exclusion, right, which is the right to prevent access, prevents free riders, but also so it creates group boundaries, which is one of Lynn's design principles. Alienation, which is the right to actually sell what we own, can actually lower costs of exit. And so property rights can play multiple complicated roles with respect to the boundaries around reciprocal relationships. And this has been one of the concerns about alienation. If I can sell my rights to the environment, and this is something I saw in the Western US, is that it was often seen as a threat to local communities when individuals could sell their water rights, because that lowered their dependence and relationships with people in the environment there, when it's seen as a fundamental threat to local reciprocal relationships. So the last thing I talk about in the book, which I'll share with you here, is not all boundaries are created the same, right? There's been some really terrific work, particularly out of the study of pastoralist systems, that say that it's not always the case that we want rigid boundaries, because the logic I mentioned to you so far would dictate that we want fairly rigid boundaries. We don't want free riders coming in. The more we can, again, maintain stable relationships with each other and with the environment, the better off things will be. That's where that core logic steers you. And empirical studies and syntheses, particularly of not exclusively pastoral systems, but particularly pastoral systems, have shown that that's not the role that boundaries play there. And again, a long story short, some of the more convincing arguments there have argued that it's because they're not, the fundamental problem that a lot of mobile pastoralists are facing is not a tragedy of the commons. It's not the avoidance of the deterioration of a shared resource. It's actually coordinating access across individuals and groups to make sure that everyone has enough of a shared resource. And so to do that, you need to have more fluid contextual boundaries, right? So pastoralism is essentially a package of adaptations to resource scarcity in the form of low rain and unpredictable pasture lands. And so the first part of that package, adaptive package, is mobility. You need to move around. Fine, but mobility doesn't get you much if you can't then negotiate access to the pasture lands that you've just moved to that might also be claimed by another person or another group. So contextual boundaries in some contexts are actually part of an important adaptive package that helps people maintain their livelihoods from resource scarce environments. The final point that I make in this book that relates to this pastoralism context, and there's some really great work. And so again, one of the kind of, I would say, almost awkward things about writing and presenting a synthesis book is that what I'm doing is piecing together lots of work that I've done some of it, but a lot of it has been developed by other people. And of course, you can see it if you read the book, but I want to make sure that I'm kind of articulating that lots of thoughts have gone into this from many different people. And there's been some really great work that's shown that the commons itself, which, when I was at Indiana in grad school, I was taught that the commons is a common pool resource, and it's subtractable. We can use it up, and it's non-excludable, and therefore creates collective action problems. There's been some really great work that argues that really those features are not kind of inherent functions of the environment. They are more functions of the relationship between humans and the environment. So pastoralists, the way they use the environment, it's less subtractable than, say, a particular fishery or groundwater system might be. And it's the excludability or the non-excludability is also a function of technologies available to us. And many of the most important regime shifts that we see have to do with the introduction of new technologies, say in the introduction of barbed wire in the Western US, that fundamentally tip the management of a system in one direction or another. So I think one of the consequences of the discussion and appreciation for different types of boundaries is also an appreciation for the nature of the commons as not being something necessarily inherent in itself, but as much as anything a function of how we relate to it, which has important institutional implications as well. So I imagine I've used up a lot of my time. I want to quickly go through the third chapter where I try to tie some things together with respect to the relationship between collective action and property rights. So I tried to make a connection to it between these two ideas in the previous chapter by arguing that, okay, boundaries are important for collective action. Again, Lane and other folks have documented this, right? We want to prevent free riding, and if there are high costs of exit, it means that people will have stable partners over time that they'll be motivated to trust and engage in reciprocal relationships with. Theory of environmental reciprocity basically argues that that same logic extends to our relationship with nature, and that's a lot of what the motivation for environmental property rights comes from, is helping enable those long-term relationships with nature. So this basically builds on that and dives more into the psychologies of kinship and reciprocity. I mentioned in the last slide that across species, it's been very well documented that I would say inarguably the two main mechanisms for the evolution of cooperation in species, including ours, are kinship and reciprocity. Now, in humans, you have things, you also have things like culture institutions, which makes the story more complicated. And environmental and cultural anthropologists have documented that it's not just genetic kinship that matters for humans, it's also what we call cultural kinship. And I think this is, well, it's not just I think this has been shown to be broadly cross-cultural, but I think if we think about this, it's not hard to find examples of this in our own lives, right? I might be spending time with a good friend of mine and his children, and he'll refer to me as Uncle Mike or Uncle Michael. Well, why does he do that? That's an example of cultural kinship, of treating non-genetically related people as if they were part of your tribe or your kin-based group. The advantage of this is fairly straightforward and intuitive, is it encourages larger scale cooperation among people who perceive each other to be part of the same kin group. One of the big aha moments that I had in writing the book, in looking at different literatures, was between the literature on the evolution of cooperation that shows time and time again that it's about kinship and reciprocity, and the psychologies that human beings bring to bear with each other and with nature. So human beings arguably have a psychology of kinship and a psychology of reciprocity. We want to identify certain people as kin, and we want to find partners for reciprocal relationships. We have a natural tendency to want to behave reciprocally with other people. Often, and this has been shown even in experimental games where there's actually not a lot of room for kind of long-term tit-for-tat relationships. There's also been an important literature that ties these psychologies to an intrinsic value for the people in the environment that we're engaging in. And this ties into another literature that makes a distinction between extrinsic and intrinsic value. People like Sam Bowles have written a lot about how this needs to be more formally incorporated into policy studies. I value something intrinsically if I value it per se, and not
Michael,
instrumentally for something else.
Finish up in 5 minutes or so. Good, thanks.
Oh, yeah, that's great, Brian. No, I was on track, I think, to finish in like 3 or 4 minutes, so that works well. So I value something intrinsically if I value it in its own right, and not for something else. And so this made me think about the Western framing of property rights and how we often think about ownership from a Western perspective as being often fairly instrumental. If I own something, it means that I don't have obligations to it. This is not entirely a Western point of view. People like Aldo Leopold and the land ethic have argued for a more reciprocal relationship to the land. But one of the main connections that I made in writing the book was between the theory of the evolution of cooperation and the literature on particularly indigenous relationships to the environment, and how many indigenous peoples view ownership. And I happened upon the work of a colleague of mine, Mehana Vaughn, and I'll just show her book right here, who wrote a really wonderful book called Kaiolu, Gathering Tides, about indigenous Hawaiian relationships to the land and the sea. And Mehana introduces this term called kuleana, which means both rights and obligations. And it really was this aha moment to me that much of the literature on indigenous environmental management and governance highlights these exact same two psychologies of kinship and reciprocity. You see it time and time again, whether it's salmon, whether it's a species of shark. Lots of different aspects of the environment are perceived as being cultural kin, and in some cases perceived as being kind of genetic kin, and are engaged in a reciprocal relationship. And so one of the main boundaries for myself that I tried to push in the book is really availing myself of these non-Western approaches to ownership and what it means to really own the environment in a way that is more intrinsically driven, that involves more of our psychologies of kinship and reciprocity that we see in many non-Western cultures. The advantage to this that's argued a lot in this literature is that intrinsic value leads to a more holistic management of the environment and to each other. And so, and that's really what the main kind of point or takeaway of the third chapter is that we need to avail ourselves of these other framings because they really do have an important message for how we should relate to the environment via ownership, because ownership should mean in many cases not just rights to the environment, but obligations to it in a more holistic way. So conclusions, I'll just pop them up right there. I mentioned, I'll skip to the second one, the book is scheduled to be published by Agenda Publishing in early 2024. I also want to just highlight my In Common podcast, which is the official podcast of the International Association for the Study of the Commons. It was, frankly, my other coping mechanism earlier in the pandemic. It let me connect with many people. And I also cite many of the people that I interviewed in the podcast. There was a kind of a synergy between the two projects. So I'm very grateful for many of my interviewees in that podcast. And then the final point I would just leave you all with is as we're all doing our work, I do think we need to think seriously about the relationship between our scholarship and the public good. It's kind of very easy to kind of plow ahead and keep on accumulating facts, and it's helpful to kind of take a step back and say, what are the public goods that I'm contributing to? What are the individual goods? And kind of deliberately steer our scholarship towards those when we can identify them. Which is, of course, a privilege to be able to have the time to think about that. But I still think it's something that's worthwhile that I'm hoping is reflected in these projects. So, Brian, thanks for the reminder. I imagine I've gone over time, but I appreciate the opportunity to share some of these ideas with you. And I'm looking forward to chatting with you in the time that remains.